Hello, folks. I'm back. We're going to talk about another early jazz scene, club, ballroom, but in a different location and a slightly different time. And as you will find, the circumstances were, well, a whole lot different at the famous store in New York than they were at the Arcadia in Chicago. One of the main differences is that the famous door didn't open until 1935. I'm going to try to pull some things together that I hadn't thought about, but they are relevant. It was a 52nd Street club. And for the early days of big band swing and the earlier jazz styles, the more sedate jazz styles, not the hot stuff, not the bebop, not the emerging black jazz that was coming, it was set up for that. Lonnie Holiday, I think, was a band leader and a broadcaster who helped popularize the club. He was one of the backers, and since he had a microphone and an audience, he could help make it more popular, and he did. But two of the driving forces were musicians, Jimmy Dorsey and Glenn Miller. And that, for those of us who know musicians and music, indicates something about this place. This is 1935, and we're moving through swing into bebop, but the people who are musicians who are backing this particular thing that's not open until 1935, they're not bebop musicians. They're not playing in the X-Sting style of jazz either. Trying to combine big band with R&B and whatnot, and no, that's not happening either. They were trying to hold on to the original Dorsey Brothers, Glenn Miller, Paul Whiteman tradition of what we call sweet jazz and sweet dance music. And they set this place up to be comfortable for white musicians because they were more comfortable with those styles than they were with the emerging bebop. Just a fact, folks. They had a different kind of color line than the Arcadia in Chicago. Although most of the jazz they featured, most of the artists that they presented were not of African descent. There are a couple of incidents that occurred there because they did occasionally hire black musicians. But it was a hostile environment in that Billie Holiday was featured there along with Teddy Wilson on piano, and there was a white band leader in the audience who they knew. And they went down to have a conversation with that person, and for the black artist to be having a conversation with one of the white patrons caused both Billie Holiday and Teddy Wilson to be fired on the spot. So this is quite different than the way things had been done 25 years earlier in Chicago. So although they eventually permitted black clientele to come into the club as patrons, and although they hired black musicians, it was a very hostile environment. The great Bessie Smith, Empress of the Blues, actually did her one and only performance on 52nd Street at the famous door. She was 40 years old, and she only did one night at any club on 52nd Street. So after you start to take a look at this from a wider view, you can see that Harlem in all its glory was really separate from what was going on 52nd Street. That's pretty obvious. However, there was a lot of good that was done, despite this lack of respect. Count Basie brought his band in early on, 1938, I think, and he was being broadcast there several nights a week because CBS had its offices on 52nd right down the street from the famous door, so it's easy to get that early technology to do these live radio broadcasts. And Basie was getting to do these things for several weeks live. And that did wonders in making him kind of a household name and his band legendary. So there were some careers of African-American artists that were actually made by this famous door. And why is it the famous door? Because it was always kind of an elite place. And the people who came there were of two sorts. People who want to be seen with important people and important people. And the important people had this tradition of, on their first visit to the famous door, once they got in, they would grab a magic marker or whatever was used in those days, and they would autograph the door itself. So over time you had all of these artists and musicians and actresses and actors and playwrights and just famous people with their signatures right on the door. And a lot of people came just to see those signatures. But thank God a lot of people came for the music. This club had a hard time for some reason. It doesn't say a whole lot about the management, and I'm not going to try to fill that in. I think you can fill that in for yourself if you're having trouble trying to keep a line of who bought it when, who owned it when, and who did this when. It's probably something illicit about what's going on there. At any rate, this club did not last long. Its reign was between 1935 and 1950. But in the later years, once bebop had firmly entrenched itself, it started hiring more, I'll call them progressive artists. And the great Benny Carter, president of the alto sax and big band writing and all that, Benny Carter, baby. He had a jamming band, and he had a young trumpet player in his band. He was screaming, playing. He come out of the Eckstein band and was going to be one of the architects of bebop. I am talking about John Burks Gillespie. That's right, Dizzy Gillespie played in that band at the famous door. And the management told Mr. Carter he had to fire that trumpet player because he couldn't play. He was playing wrong notes. Well, now, let's get to it. Dizzy is the architect of bebop. And so we got rhythms that are crazy, and we got harmonies that are crazy, and sometimes the musicians would force their will upon the harmony by altering notes within the structure. And for those people who are, you know, a little bit musically literate, the blue notes. The blue notes are the most blue, are the flat 3, flat 5, flat 9, you know. And they had this little guy, Berkeley here, Burke Gillespie, who was playing sharp 4s and sharp 11s and flat 5s and flat 9s, and to the un-bebopped ear, it sounds like a bunch of mess and wrong notes. Even Louis Armstrong did not have any respect for bebopping, yet he got a better understanding of it. So poor Dizzy, he got fired off his gig at the famous door for moving the movement called jazz forward, called bebop forward. one of the worst things you can do is be stuck on yourself to the point that you don't want to take in any new influences. You don't want to change. Things move past you. And that is what happened to the famous store. They were very late coming to the bebop era. Mentions had already happened. You had all of the hot jazz down in Harlem. People were going there. Matter of fact, one of the biggest clubs in Harlem, another club that has a kind of sordid history, was that Cotton Club. And I didn't know much about the Cotton Club. I've seen some movies in which it is featured, but there are some details that were chronicled in the research I did concerning a parity between the Cotton Club, which actually began in Harlem, and the famous door, and that is that the Cotton Club did not make any excuses for its backwards-looking view of race. I did not know that throughout the Cotton Club, even when it was in Harlem, you had these big wood structures that made the place look like an old Southern mansion. I didn't know that. I didn't know that where the bandstand was, where most of the black musicians played, was on what would have been the porch of this Southern mansion, right in front of the two double doors. I didn't know that. That's an indignity that we don't talk about a whole lot, but we should, because Ellington played there, and Basie played there, and Eckstein played there, and Louis Armstrong played there, and eventually King Arthur played there. So many musicians played there, made that place famous, that for them to have that overt hostility to them right up to the stage they played on, that's pretty horrific. But that's what these early pioneers were willing to go through in order to continue what they love. This new music, let's develop it. Let it speak for us. And that is what it did. Now, there are famous doors all over the country. Everybody wanted to have their own little famous door. There is even a famous door that might still be open as far away from New York City as New Orleans, Louisiana. Yeah. So the famous door has its legacy. It helped to transition from big band to bebop, although very, very, very cautiously it did this. And it became one of the earlier places where white musicians and jazz musicians could actually congregate and play in private. You could not go to these integrated sessions with an open audience, but they had a door upstairs that was just big enough for little jam sessions similar to what was going on at Minton's Playhouse, that allowed musicians from swing and bebop to share ideas and inspirations and continue to support the development of this wonderful music we call jazz. So, the famous door had a lot of important people, a lot of celebrities, but it is actually infamous for its humanity and how it handled its entertainers. One of the things that led to its demise is, after a while, they weren't making a whole lot of money on 57 because all the action was down in Harlem and in the Village, because the Village became the place for bebop. And it came a point at which this famous door couldn't even pay its musicians for the week, because things had dwindled that far down, because the Village was starting and 52nd Street was old time, so let's go to the new thing. And that's all I got to say about the famous door. I hope you enjoyed this little conversation about New York City jazz in the famous 52nd Street area. Thank you.